Section 11 of The Basis of Morality by Arthur Schopenhauer, translated by Arthur Bullock. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 3, Chapter 9. On the Ethical Difference of Character. There still remains a question to be resolved before the basis which I have given to ethics can be presented in all its completeness. It is this: on what does the great difference in the moral behavior of men rest? If compassion be the original incentive of all true, that is, disinterested justice and loving kindness, how comes it that some are, while others are not, influenced thereby? Are we to suppose that ethics, which discloses the moral stimulus, is also capable of setting it in motion? Can ethics fashion the hard-hearted man anew, so that he becomes compassionate and, as a consequence, just and humane? Certainly not. The difference of character is innate and ineradicable. The wicked man is born with his wickedness, as much as the serpent is with its poison fangs and glands, nor can the former change his nature a whit more than the latter. Velle non discitur. To use one's will is not a thing that can be taught, is a saying of Nero's tutor. In the Meno, Plato minutely investigates the nature of virtue, and inquires whether it can or cannot be taught. He quotes a passage from Theognis: "Ale didaskon upete pisis tonkakan androagaton." But thou wilt ne'er by teaching make the bad man virtuous, and finally reaches this conclusion: "Aretiani oite phise, oite didacton, aletia mira paragignomeni, anef nu isan parayignete." Translation: virtue would appear not to come naturally, that is, through the physical order of things, nor can it be taught, but in whomsoever it dwells there it is present, apart from the intellect, under divine ordinance. End translation. Here the terms phise and theamira form a distinction, in my opinion, much the same way as that between physical and metaphysical. Socrates, the father of ethics, if we may trust Aristotle, declared that oike phimenianes daito spodeos sinai e fablos. Translation: it is not in our power to be either good or bad. End translation. Moreover, Aristotle himself expresses the same view. Pasigardoki e castaton iton iparkin phisitos ke gardike, ke sophroniki ke tala echumin eftis ekienetis. Translation: for it appears that the different characters of all men are in some way implanted in them by nature. If we are just and temperate and otherwise virtuous, we are so straightway from our birth. End translation. We find also a similar conviction very decidedly expressed in the fragments attributed to the Pythagorean Archytas and preserved by Stabaeus in the Florilegium. If not authentic, they are certainly very old. Aureli gives them in his Opuscula Graecorum Sententiosa et Moralia. There we read in the Dorian dialect as follows: "Tas garloiois ke apodixesin potikromenes aretas deon epistamas potegoreven, aretande ton itikan ke veltistan exin to alogo mereos tas sijas, katan ke pitines imen legometa katatoitos ion elefteri di ke sophrones." Translation: for the so-called virtues that require reasoning and demonstration ought to be called sciences. By the term virtue we mean rather a certain moral and excellent disposition of the soul's unreasoning part. This disposition determines the character which we show, and in accordance with which we are called generous, just, or temperate. End translation. On examining the virtues and vices, as summarized by Aristotle in the De Virtutibus et Vitis, it will be found that all of them, without exception, are not properly thinkable unless assumed to be inborn qualities, and that only as such can they be genuine. If, in consequence of reasoned reflection, we take them as voluntary, they are then seen to lose their reality, and pass into the region of empty forms, whence it immediately follows that their permanence and resistance under the storm and stress of circumstance could not be counted on. and the same is true of the virtue of loving kindness, of which Aristotle, in common with all the ancients, knows nothing. Montaigne keeps, of course, his skeptical tone, but he practically agrees with the venerable authorities above quoted when he says, Serait-il vrai que pour être bon tout à fait, il ne le faille être par occulte, naturelle et universelle propriété, sans loi, sans raison, sans exemple? Translation: Are we to believe it is true that we can only be thoroughly good by virtue of a certain occult, natural, and universal faculty, without law, without reason, without precedent? End translation. Lichtenberg hits the mark exactly in his Vermischte Schriften. He writes, quote, All virtue arising from premeditation is not worth much. What is wanted is feeling or habit. End quote. Lastly, it should be noted that Christianity itself, in its original teaching, recognizes and bears witness to this inherent immutable difference between character and character. In the Sermon on the Mount, we find the allegory of the fruit which is determined by the nature of the tree that bears it. And then in the following verse we read, O agathos anthropos ecto agathou tisavrou tiskardies afto proferito agathon che O ponbros anthropos ecto ponirou tisavrou tiskardias afto proferito poniron. Translation: The good man out of the good treasure of his heart bringeth forth that which is good, and the evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart bringeth forth that which is evil. End translation. But it was Kant who first completely cleared up this important point through his profound doctrine of the empirical and intelligible character. He showed that the empirical character, which manifests itself in time and in multiplicity of action, is a phenomenon, while the reality behind it is the intelligible character, which, being the essential constitution of the thing in itself underlying the phenomenon, is independent of time, space, plurality, and change. In this way alone can be explained what is so astonishing, and yet so well known to all who have learnt life's lessons: the fixed unchangeableness of human character. There are certain ethical writers whose aim is the moral improvement of men, and who talk of progress made in the path of virtue, but their assurances are always met and victoriously confuted by the irrefragable facts of experience, which prove that virtue is nature's work and cannot be inculcated. The character is an original datum, immutable and incapable of any amelioration through correction by the intellect. Now, were this not so, and further, if, as the above-mentioned dull-headed preachers maintain, an improvement of the character, and hence a constant advance towards the good, were possible by means of moral instruction, then, unless we are prepared to suppose that all the various religious institutions and all the efforts of the moralists fail in their purpose, we should certainly expect to find that the older half of mankind, at least on an average, is distinctly better than the younger. This, however, is so far from being the case that it is not to the old, who have, as we see, grown worse by experience, but to the young that we look for something good. It may happen that in his old age one man appears somewhat better, another worse, than he was in his youth. But the reason is not far to seek. It is simply because with length of days the intelligence by constant correction becomes riper, and hence the character stands out in purer and clearer shape, while early life is a prey to ignorance, mistakes, and chimeras, which now present false motives and now veil the real. For a fuller explanation, I would refer the reader to the principles laid down in Chapter 3 of the preceding essay on the freedom of the will. It is true that among convicts the young have a large majority, but this is because, when a tendency to crime exists in the character, it soon finds a way of expressing itself in acts, and of reaching its goal, the galleys or the gibbet, while he, whom all the inducements to wrongdoing which a long life offers have failed to lead astray, is not likely to fall at the 11th hour. Hence the respect paid to age is, in my opinion, due to the fact that the old are considered to have passed through a test of 60 or 70 years and kept their integrity unsullied. For this, of course, is the sine qua non of the honor accorded them. These things are too well known for any one in real life to be misled by the promises of the moralists we have spoken of. He who has once been proved guilty of evil-doing is never again trusted, just as the noble nature, of which a man has once given evidence, is always confidently believed in, whatever else may have changed. Apparare sequitur esse. What one does follows from what one is. Forms, as we have seen in Part 2, Chapter 8, a pregnant tenet of the schoolmen. Everything in the world works according to the unchangeable constitution of which its being, its essentia, is composed, and man is no exception. As the individual is, so will he, so must he act, and the liberum arbitrium indifferentiae, free and indifferent choice, is an invention of philosophy in her childhood, long since exploded, although there are some old women and doctors academicals who still like to drag it about with them. The three fundamental springs of human action, egoism, malice, compassion, are inherent in every one in different and strangely unequal proportions. Their combination in any given case determines the weight of the motives that present themselves and shapes the resulting line of conduct. To an egoistic character, egoistic motives alone appeal, and those which suggest either compassion or malice have no appreciable effect. Thus, a man of this type will sacrifice his interests as little to take vengeance on his foes as to help his friends. Another, whose nature is highly susceptible to malicious motives, will not shrink from doing great harm to himself, so only he may injure his neighbor. For there are characters which take such delight in working mischief on others, that they forget their own loss, which is perhaps equal to what they inflict. One may say of such, dum alteri noceat sui negligens, disregarding himself so long as he injures the other. These are the people that plunge with passionate joy into the battle in which they expect to receive quite as many wounds as they deal. Indeed, experience not seldom testifies that they are ready deliberately first to kill the man who thwarts their purposes, and then themselves, in order to escape the penalty of the law. On the other hand, goodness of heart consists of a deeply felt, all-embracing compassion for everything that has breath, and especially for man, because, in proportion as the intelligence develops, capacity for pain increases, and hence the countless sufferings of human beings in mind and body have a much stronger claim to compassion than those of animals, which are only physical, and in any case less acute. This goodness of heart, therefore, in the first place restrains a man from doing any sort of harm to others, and, next, it bids him give succor whenever and wherever he sees distress. And the path of compassion may lead as far in one direction as malice does in the other. Certain rare characters of fine sensibility take to heart the calamities of others more than their own, so that they make sacrifices which, it may be, entail on themselves a greater amount of suffering than that removed from those they benefit. Nay, in cases where several, or perhaps a large number of persons at one time can be helped in this way, such men do not, if need be, flinch from absolute self-effacement. Arnold von Winkelried was one of these. So was Paulinus, Bishop of Nola, in the 5th century, when the Vandals crossed over from Africa and invaded Italy. Of him we read in Johann von Müller's Weltgeschichte that, quote, in order to ransom some of the prisoners, he had already disposed of all the church plate, his own and his friends' private property. Then, on seeing the anguish of a widow, whose only son was being carried off, he offered himself for servitude in the other's stead. For whoever was of suitable age, and had not fallen by the sword, was taken captive to Carthage. There is, then, an enormous difference between character and character. Being original and innate, it measures the responsiveness of the individual to this or that motive, and those alone, to which he is specially sensitive, will appeal to him with anything like compelling force. As in chemistry, with unchangeable certainty, one substance reacts only upon acids, another only upon alkalis, so, with equal invariableness, different natures respond to different stimuli. The motives suggesting loving kindness, which stirs so deeply a good disposition, can, of themselves, affect nothing in a heart that listens only to the promptings of egoism. If it be wished to induce the egoist to act with beneficence and humanity, this can be done but in one way. He must be made to believe that the assuaging of others' suffering will, somehow or other, surely turn out to his own advantage. What, indeed, are most moral systems but attempts of different kinds in this direction? But such procedure only misleads, does not better, the will. To make a real improvement, it would be necessary to transform the entire nature of the individual's susceptibility for motives. Thus, from one we should have to remove his indifference to the suffering of others as such; from another, the delight which he feels in causing pain; from a third, the natural tendency which makes him regard the smallest increase of his own well-being as so far outweighing all other motives, that the latter become as dust in the balance. Only it is far easier to change lead into gold than to accomplish such a task. For it means the turning round, so to say, of a man's heart in his body, the remoulding of his very being. In point of fact, all that can be done is to clear the intellect, correct the judgment, and so bring him to a better comprehension of the objective realities and actual relations of life. This effected, the only result gained is that his will reveals itself more logically, distinctly, and decidedly, with no false ring in its utterance. It should be noted that just as many a good act rests at bottom on false motives, on well-meant yet illusory representations of an advantage to be attained thereby in this or another world, so not a few misdeeds are due solely to an imperfect understanding of the conditions of human life. It is on this latter truth that the American penitentiary system is based. Here the aim is not to improve the heart, but simply to educate the head of the criminal, so that he may intellectually come to perceive that prosperity is more surely, indeed more easily, reached by work and honesty than by idleness and knavery. By the proper presentment of motives legality may be secured, but not morality. It is possible to remodel what one does, but not what one wills to do, and it is to the will alone that real moral worth belongs. It is not possible to change the goal which the will strives after, but only the path expected to lead thither. Instruction may alter the selection of means, but not the choice of the ultimate object which the individual keeps before him in all he does. This is determined by his will in accordance with its original nature. It is true that the egoist may be brought to understand that, if he gives up certain small advantages, he will gain greater, and the malicious man may be taught that by injuring others, he will injure himself still more. But egoism itself, and malice itself, will never be argued out of a person, as little as a cat can be talked out of her inclination for mice. Similarly with goodness of heart. If the judgment be trained, if the relations and conditions of life become understood, in a word, if the intellect be enlightened, the character dominated by loving kindness will be led to express itself more consistently and completely than it otherwise could. This happens when we perceive the remoter consequences which our conduct has for others, the sufferings, perhaps, that overtake them indirectly and only after lapse of time, through one act or another of ours, which we had no idea was so harmful. It occurs, too, when we come to discern the evil results of many a well-meant action, as, for instance, the screening of a criminal, and it is especially true when we realize that the neminem laida, injure no one, has in all cases precedence over the omnis juva, help all men. In this sense there is undoubtedly such a thing as a moral education, an ethical training capable of making men better. But it goes only as far as I have indicated, and its limits are quickly discovered. The head is filled with the light of knowledge, the heart remains unimproved. The fundamental and determining element in things moral, no less than in things intellectual and things physical, is that which is inborn. Art is always subordinate, and can only lend a helping hand. Each man is what he is, as it were, by the grace of God, jur divino, thea, mira, by divine dispensation. Du bist am Ende, was du bist. Setz dir Perücken auf von Millionen Locken, setz deinen Fuß auf Ellenheusocken. Du bleibst doch immer was du bist. Translation: in spite of all, thou art still what thou art. Though wigs with countless curls thy headgear be, though shoes and ellen height adorn thy feet, unchanged thou e'er remainest what thou art. End translation. But the reader, I am sure, has long been wishing to put the question, where then does blame and merit come in? The answer is fully contained in Part II, Chapter 8, to which I therefore beg to call particular attention. It is there that the explanation which otherwise would now follow found a natural place, because the matter is closely connected with Kant's doctrine of the coexistence of freedom and necessity. Our investigation led to the conclusion that, once the motives are brought into play, the operari, what is done, is a thing of absolute necessity. Consequently, freedom, the existence of which is betokened solely by the sense of responsibility, cannot but belong to the esse, what one is. No doubt the reproaches of conscience have to do, in the first place, and ostensibly, with our acts, but through these they, in reality, reach down to what we are, for what we do is the only indisputable index of what we are, and reflects our character just as faithfully as symptoms betray the malady. Hence it is to this esse, to what we are, that blame and merit must ultimately be attributed. Whatever we esteem and love, or else despise and hate, in others, is not a changeable transient appearance, but something constant, stable, and persistent. It is that which they are. If we find reason to alter our first opinion about anyone, we do not suppose that he is changed, but that we have been mistaken in him. In like manner, when we are pleased or displeased with our own conduct, we say that we are satisfied or dissatisfied with ourselves, meaning, in reality, with that which we are, and are unalterably, irreversibly. And the same is true with regard to our intellectual qualities, nay, it even applies to the physiognomy. How is it possible, then, for blame and merit to lie otherwise than in what we are? As we saw in Part 2, Chapter 7, conscience is that register of our acts which is always growing longer, and therefore that acquaintance with ourselves which every day becomes more complete. Conscience concerns itself directly with all that we do, when at one time, actuated by egoism or perhaps malice, we turn a deaf ear to compassion, which bids us at least refrain from harming others if we will not afford them help and protection, or when again, at another time, we overcome the first two incentives and listen to the voice of the third. Both cases measure the distinction we draw between ourselves and others, and on this distinction depends in the last resort the degree of our morality or immorality, that is, of our justice and loving kindness, or the reverse. Little by little, the number of those actions whose testimony is significant on this point accumulates in the storehouse of our memory, and thus the lineaments of our character are depicted with ever greater clearness, and a true knowledge of ourselves is nearer attainment. And out of such knowledge there springs a sense of satisfaction or dissatisfaction with ourselves, with that which we are, according as we have been ruled by egoism, by malice, or else by compassion. In other words, according as the difference we have made between ourselves and others is greater or smaller, and when we look outside ourselves, it is by the same standard that we judge those about us, and we become acquainted with their character, less perfectly indeed, yet by the same empirical method as we employ with reference to our own. In this case, our feelings take the form of praise, approval, respect, or, on the other hand, of reproach, displeasure, contempt, and they are the objective translation, so to say, of the subjective satisfaction or dissatisfaction, the latter deepening perhaps into remorse, which arises in us when we sit in judgment on ourselves. Lastly, there is the evidence of language. We find certain constantly occurring forms of speech which bear eloquent testimony to the fact that the blame we cast upon others is in reality directed against their unchangeable character, touching but superficially what they do, that virtue and vice are practically, if tacitly, regarded as inherent, unalterable qualities. The following are some of these expressions. Jetzt sehe ich, wie du bist. Now I know your nature. In dir habe ich mich geirrt. I was mistaken in you. Now I see what you are. Voilà donc comme tu es. This, then, is what you are. So bin ich nicht. I am not a person of that sort. Ich bin nicht der Mann, der fähig wäre, sie zu hintergehen. I am not the man to impose upon you. Also, les hommes bien nés, persons well born, that is, noble-minded, the Spanish bien nacido, evienis, properly well born, evienia, properly nobility of birth, used for virtuous and virtue, generosioris animi amicis, a friend of lofty mind, generosus, literally of noble birth, etc. Reason is a necessary condition for conscience, but only because without the former a clear and connected recollection is impossible. From its very nature, conscience does not speak till after the act. Hence we talk of being arraigned before its bar. Strictly speaking, it is improper to say that conscience speaks beforehand, for it can only do so indirectly, that is, when the remembrance of particular cases in the past leads us, through reflection, to disapprove of some analogous course of action, while yet in embryo. Such is the ethical fact as delivered by consciousness. It forms of itself a metaphysical problem which does not directly belong to the present question, but which will be touched on in the last part. Conscience, then, is nothing else than the acquaintance we make with our own changeless character through the instrumentality of our acts. A little consideration will show that this definition harmonizes perfectly with, and hence receives additional confirmation from, what I have here specially emphasized, namely, the fact that susceptibility for the motives of egoism, of malice, and of compassion, which is so widely dissimilar in different individuals, and on which the whole moral value of a man depends, cannot be interpreted by anything else, nor be gained or removed by instruction, as if it were something born in time, and therefore variable and subject to chance. On the contrary, we have seen that it is innate and fixed, an ultimate datum, admitting of no further explanation. Thus an entire life, with the whole of its manifold activity, may be likened to a clock dial, that marks every movement of the internal works, as they were made once for all, or it resembles a mirror, wherein alone, with the eye of his intellect, each person sees reflected the essential nature of his own will, that is, the core of his being. Whoever takes the trouble to thoroughly think out what has been put forward here, and in Part 2, Chapter 8, will discover in the foundation given by me to ethics a logical consecution, a rounded completeness, wanting to all other theories, to say nothing of the consonance of my view with the facts of experience, a consonance which he will look for in vain elsewhere, for only the truth can uniformly and consistently agree with itself and with nature, while all false principles are internally at variance with themselves, and externally contradict the testimony of experience, which at every step records its silent protest. I am perfectly aware that the truths advanced in this essay, and particularly here at the close, strike directly at many deeply rooted prejudices and mistakes, and especially at those attaching to a certain rudimentary system of morals, now much in vogue, and suitable for elementary schools. But I cannot own to feeling any penitence or regret, for in the first place I am addressing neither children nor the profanum vulgus, but an academy of light and learning. Their inquiry is a purely theoretical one, concerned with the ultimate fundamental verities of ethics, and to a most serious question a serious answer is undoubtedly expected. And secondly, in my opinion, there can be no such thing as harmless mistakes, still less privileged or useful ones. On the contrary, every error works infinitely more evil than good. If, however, it is wished to make existing prepossessions the standard of truth, or the boundary beyond which its investigation is not to go, then it would be more honest to abolish philosophical faculties and academies altogether, for where no reality exists, there also no semblance of it should be. End of section 11.